pleasure. I'm an academic. I specialize in doing impractical things, so it's great to be around very practical people who are doing extremely significant work. I just want to start, we'll come back to this beautiful role of weird fetish objects here in a second, but it's a nice way to sort of set the tone. For today, I'm going to take us down kind of a weird road. I was supposed to be talking about obfuscation. I've talked about obfuscation a lot. It's a book Helen and I wrote. You can easily get a pirated copy on arg.fail if you don't want to give money to Amazon. And it's great, but whatever. Talked about that before. I wanted to talk about, I wanted to get very concrete because I know I was going to be speaking with a lot of people who are going to be very concrete about things. And so this talk starts with this famous quote from Stuart Brand, the opening paragraph of the first blockbuster Whole Earth catalog, packed to the gills with cyber utopianism of the very specific 1960s variety, where we would all be watched over by machines of loving grace that would enable a new, liberated form of human existence. So my talk is called "We Are as Spies and Might as Well Get Good at It." I should have been a graphic designer, but and my talk is called this because, of course, the future that was envisioned was not the future that we got. The future that we got was a future where many of the smartest and most competent people among us are spending their entire careers figuring out how to monitor and gather data about our activities in order to show us ads that we are puzzled by and often even fail to click on. And then, in fact, I think a much more prescient article, if I can just give this a shout out, I'm obsessed with this article. It's from 1975. It's from a guy named Paul Armour, who was a RAND person, who was like a hardcore cybernetic infrastructure dude. And he was given this assignment by the Department of Defense, who were trying to game what they thought the USSR might be doing. He and a bunch of other computer scientists were put in a room and given this job. You have to design a system for the surveillance of all citizens and visitors within the boundaries. The system is not to be too obtrusive or obvious. What do you make? And what they built was an electronic funds transfer system, a payment system. They built Apple Pay. They built PayPal. They created a huge mock-up version of this because they realized, oh, this way we get location. We get an object people have to carry with them if they want to engage in transactions. We get granular data about their specific retail activities. What books are they buying? What kind of food are they buying? We get, in other words, all of the things that some of us now have in some forms in terms of things like Amazon, Facebook, other groups that are all interested in engaging in that kind of tracking, and other of us get through things like the electronic benefit transfer system, right? SNAP, food stamps. Those are some of the most heavily data mined purchase systems in existence. We live in a world in which, I don't know how many people are familiar with this company. I'm also obsessed with this company. Hoxton Analytics, the privacy-preserving retail analysis company. This is in-store retail. This is physical retail. Your visitor footprint is literal. They monitor shoes. They mount cameras at shin level pointing down, and then they use real-time analysis and some very clever deep learning techniques to learn things about people from their shoes, and then use the shoes to follow them around the store and figure out like where they pause, when they're like making a decision between one thing and another, who they talk to, if they can connect relationships between them. And the whole promise is it preserves privacy because your face is not being recorded. Instead, it's just your shoes. This is the kind of system within which we find ourselves. And much of what I was going to say in this section has already been said and better by previous speakers, so you can actually construct your own version of my talk out of the following slides. This is actually a great paper. It just came out. I strongly recommend it. If you are interested in learning about the brave new world of unbelievably creepy stalkers and how they can have incredible power to track individuals through systems that were designed to show them shoes and light bulbs, I strongly recommend it. Needs no explanation. You can already tell where I'm going with this. Likewise, this. So skipping ahead, I wanted with that framing in mind, and with some of these practical examples at hand from earlier talks, I wanted to take us in a slightly different direction and look at personal practice. We focus a lot on tool use, but I love the fact that in some of the earlier panels, we discuss things like the path of slightly less resistance. We discuss things like incremental versions of security, security as a daily practice, which is something that I know that James has thoughts about as well. So for the last several months in my spare time, I've been researching a community that has had exactly this problem. A community that had practical, powerful privacy tools, but also knew that they were under constant threat of detailed observation by people who wanted to figure out things about them. And a community that therefore had to evolve techniques that were particular to their everyday lives and to the communities of which they were a part. Not just tools, not just objects, but practices. That community was spies. And the practice is called tradecraft. And as it turns out, it's kind of revelatory to read the tradecraft literature, which goes back decades and decades, from the perspective of trying to secure communities from a wide variety of different threats in spaces like social networks and surveilled smart cities. This has already been well addressed, but one of the crucial things that's interesting about studying spy tradecraft is these are people who often face clear and immediate threats, but who nonetheless, a key aspect of tradecraft threat modeling is to keep calm, right? To not get overwhelmed, to have that kind of security skeptic capacity, to not feel like we're doomed, I have no idea what to do, everything is screwed forever. Because in fact, of course, what they observed, which is a phenomenon that has already been discussed in different ways today, is security fatigue, right? Like, this is the classic case of like, if everyone has to use their security badge to open the door day after day after day, every time they go out for a smoke, they start holding the door open for each other. It's just politeness. Someone has a package, you hold the door open for them. If you don't have a model that accounts for the fact that it's exhausting to be paranoid, that it's exhausting to have to manage constant security and privacy threats, that you actually need to have a fairly clear sense of what is important to you and to the people around you to protect yourself from, and to build accordingly, right? To sort of begin to think about your tradecraft in those terms. It was fascinating to me that spies who would often be in grave danger would nonetheless have to think in these terms. Having to live this way for too long makes you crazy. And the other thing was that they built really beautiful, sexy tools for in-house use to make these practices not just viable, but sort of fascinating. And this is a weird personal thing of mine, but often the ways in which privacy and privacy practices are framed is very puritanical and boring, and it's often exactly either forms of victim blaming or forms of like, well, I mean, I know Facebook keeps you in touch with your friends, but have you ever considered sitting in your apartment alone and staring at the wall? But espionage and many kinds of criminal practice are actually quite alluring. They're rather sexy. And that seems like an interesting way to think about the idea of these everyday security and privacy practices, that there's something quite thrilling about them. These beautiful tools are flaps and seals tools. This was the CIA's in-house system made out of ivory, of all things, and wood, for being able to surreptitiously open documents. And by doing so, to learn how your documents might be surreptitiously opened, so that you could become aware of that, so you could begin to think about mail in those terms. Two things I'm not going to go into much depth about, but I just want to introduce these terms, are two of the canonical sets in American espionage of tradecraft practice. One is called the Moscow Rules. It was an unofficial set of rules of thumb that was gradually formalized and only came out when a number of spies went into retirement and began to talk about them. And it's essentially just a set of security and privacy aphorisms, things to bear in mind, little almost kind of Yoda-like phrases. And they're amazing to read in the context of the challenges that we face now, including things like vary your patterns, go with the flow. In fact, weirdly, I think go with the flow might be the first time that phrase was used, not by Jerry Brown, not in the context of 60s hippies, but in the context of people being trained to go into Moscow or East Germany and work as spies. Go with the flow to blend in until the time that you need to take action. In some cases, it may actually be more worthwhile, depending on your threat model, depending on what you want to do, to have a Facebook account that is the most boring, banal thing in the entire universe and has nothing whatsoever of value in it. I personally take great pleasure in the idea that all Facebook becomes a tedious soybean monoculture, you know, of like everyone liking and following the same things, generating no data of value. One other that I would mention is a fascinating document that came to light after Dulles, and it feels really weird for me as a lifelong despiser of the CIA to actually be talking about them in a positive way. But after Dulles passed away, they raided his house basically to put all of the documents in storage, and his biographer found that he'd written down 74 rules of thumb for everyday espionage tradecraft for working as a counterintelligence person who was aware that people were trying to learn things about you. And they combine a wonderful element of practicality with also like larger reflections on what it means to practice privacy every day without making yourself nuts, without turning into a weird troll. And many of the things are especially striking because they're all about the importance of not being drawn in by networked communication systems. I especially like the phrase, make a day's journey rather than take the risk of using phone or post. Like face-to-face meetings are actually great. Face-to-face meetings encourage solidarity and community action. Use vague speech. Use dead drops. Use what's called legend construction, which is recognizing that your public persona, your social network persona, is false and should be filled with false things. Why would you ever tell Zuckerberg anything true? He doesn't deserve it. Never saying anything more than anyone needs to specifically know. Ways of vetting people, operational cadence, cellular structure and compartmentalization, and rediscovering the pleasures of the analog, of things that don't generate digital trails because they happen face-to-face, in person, they are written down and then destroyed. Obviously, some of this is theatrical, much of this is ludicrously paranoid, but I just want to introduce this as maybe a genre of ways that we could think about these practices. This is a personal favorite of mine. This is a phrase that Eliot Spitzer would always quote until he got himself destroyed. Never write when you can talk, never talk when you can nod, never put anything in email. The original phrase for this actually comes from a turn-of-the-century Boston ward boss, but it's still, he just updated it for our current age. So this talk is just to say that there's a whole realm of practices that exist that are ways of reminding ourselves that privacy is an act of mindfulness. Privacy and security are things that we do every day to protect ourselves and to protect the people in our lives. And that the people in our lives, very much to your point, are to some degree relying on us to be able to be responsible in this regard. And that there may be a genre of practice that is right there waiting for us to adopt that could help us start to make that into something that would not just be like important, but dare I say it, fun. Thank you very much. Had to use this visual.
So the bad news is that I have nothing to say now that hasn't already been said. I have no good framings. All of the things I would suggest, from threat modeling to mindfulness,